Errol, what's going on, man? Welcome back.
Thanks, Larry. It's always a pleasure to see you and be back on the show. Again, I have now had the culmination of my career twice being on the dad edge.
Oh my gosh, man, you're too kind. You know what's so funny though is I was actually reminiscing about our first show that we did, and then the second one where you did a Q&A with the Alliance, and I was like, man, I just felt like such camaraderie with you. I remember us even mentioning like we should do the Errol and Larry show, and I think we
Yeah.
even said like we joked about it, like Bob Newhart, like Daryl and Larry and Errol. So right. But for the men who didn't hear you on the first episode, which by the way we did air it, it was just you and I, right? But then the
Yep.
second one was, and we aired this one too, was actually what we call an exclusive Q&A with Dad Edge Alliance, where our Alliance guys could come on. We recorded it, and you basically answered questions around leadership and the process around leadership and that kind of thing. But for the guys who didn't hear those first two shows, let's just go to your who you are, what you're
Yeah.
all about, and your origin story.
Yeah. And I will say before I do that seminar, for lack of a better term, that we did with your group was fantastic. I only spoke for about 15 minutes, I think. And then I think we went another hour with Q&A, if I remember
You
correctly. So
did.
it was super powerful. It was awesome. So essentially what I do now, right? I'm a leadership consultant, for lack of a better term. And so is everybody else. But where do I think I separate myself from, again, you throw a rock these days and you can hit a Navy SEAL who's doing leadership consulting, and everybody's doing a good job. They truly are. Um, but where do I separate myself? Well, I've got a bit of a more unique background than that, which I can get into. But what I did is develop a true process, right? And ultimately it's a decision making process. Leadership is decision making, right? How do we scale? How do we scale down? How do we hire? How do we fire? How do we motivate? Right? How do we figure out what to hold people accountable to? If as we go through this, what we're going to find is it's all the same decision making process. And all I did, based on my time as a Navy SEAL, FBI special agent, kind of working in those really dangerous situations, said, okay, I looked back and said, when did I do really well at stuff? And when did I not do well? And what was the common denominator? And the common denominator was I did really well in super high stressful situations because I was hyper focused on all the elements of proper decision making again. So that's kind of what I developed. And I'm sure we'll break that down a little bit more as we go, but it's very basic, starting with emotions, going through how we typically act on those emotions, being aware of it, right? Establishing what our go-to behaviors are, and then establishing what we want them to be, making a plan. That's what we go through every time we make a decision. So that's kind of what I'm doing now, and that's what I base it off of, right? So when I talk to people, um, we're very structured in how we do things because we need to break down each element of the process. It's not a whole lot of what do you want to talk about today? There's nothing wrong with that. So that's where I am. That's where I am, right? I was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, so I kind of grew up in that leadership atmosphere. Went to the surface fleet as an officer. I was on a ship, laterally transferred to the SEAL teams. Was at SEAL Team 4, SEAL Team 1. Got injured on deployment, got medically discharged, went into the private sector for several years. I was in sales management and leadership. Was in New York City on 9/11. So that changed the trajectory of my life like it did most people. Decided to get back into the game, got myself medically cleared, joined the FBI, worked counterterrorism, was on the New York SWAT team, was attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment for a period of time for combat operations in Afghanistan. Did some Russian organized crime and gang work as well, but primarily a counterterrorism investigator. And just got frustrated with the culture at the FBI. I love doing the FBI work. There was it was so much fun being a special agent with the FBI, but the scrutiny they're getting today is earned, and it's a larger picture of why I left. I saw those issues on a more micro level, and and then now they're not surprising. If you see something on a micro level, at some point it's going to get to a macro level. So that's when I just said, look, I think I've got to something to offer people who care about leadership or just getting better at whatever they're doing. So I started Leader 193. And that's it. That's me in a nutshell. So it's good to talk to you, Larry. We'll see you next. No, I'm just kidding.
Right. Is that all you've done? I mean, is that it? Man, that's just, gosh, like I just thought that's unbelievable, man. And obviously I remember, you know, your resume, as you said it on the last time on the show, and what an incredible experience. Looking back on those experiences, and I know that there was some controversy and there were some things happening at what you said, you know, the micro level, which I agree, they do emerge at a macro level, which, by the way, side note, guys, if there are things happening to you in your life, your marriage and parenting at a micro level, sooner or later, it will pop out as a macro level and impact others. So a lot of guys have this
100%.
idea, like, right? Yeah, like shove it down, don't deal with it, don't, you know, resist it, don't think about it, don't face it. You know, that's going to pop out sooner
or don't sweat the small stuff, right? That's the excuse, right? That was a great book and a great saying for a while until we used it as an excuse not to deal with small issues that will compound themselves.
Or it's like, what is small stuff? Like, I don't really know how to decipher that one. But going back to the things that you've appreciated most in your experience and the things that have really moved the needle in your own professional and personal life, what were some of those lessons learned in all of your training, you know, within the SEAL teams, within the FBI, within even training other people within 193? What's been the things that have moved the needle the most for you?
It's going to sound cliche, and that's okay because it is, because it's accurate. It's an absolute awareness of everything you're doing at all times, right? I think the medical or the scientific term for that is metacognition, being aware of what you're aware of. And that is really the basis of everything that I look back on and say, when I had success, I was hyper aware of the emotion I was feeling at the time. I was hyper aware of the action that emotion might drive, right? I'm angry, and when I'm angry, I tend to lash out, that type of thing. I was hyper aware of the behavior that I needed to exhibit in that moment to make that interaction, whatever it was, big or small, the right one. And I was hyper aware of a planning process in my head. Specifically, what am I looking to accomplish in this situation? Again, sounds like it makes perfect sense, but it's not what everybody always does. People do those things intuitively, right? There's a trigger, we have an emotion, we have an established behavior we fall back on. However ill-conceived it might be, we make a plan in our head, we execute it, and then we reflect back on it and either make an excuse for what happened or ignore it, right? That happens if you're walking into a room and you see a person you don't like, or all of a sudden you need to cut 40%, of the people from your Fortune 500 company. It's still the same exact process that you go through. So the game changer for everything has always been being aware of each one of those elements of the process. And I can look back on and say, well, when I had my missteps, which are plentiful, believe me, I could look back and go, well, I just wasn't taking the situation or my emotions seriously enough.
Right.
And I just acted randomly. Oh, and what a surprise. I had this terrible result. So for me, uniquely enough, I suppose it was during those real danger times where I was able to see things and be very aware of what was happening. It was the everyday that I was struggling with. Right. The things I took for granted, perhaps the relationships, or just, again, walking into the office and not being aware that I might be feeling a little crappy today. And then just naturally being rude to people, right? Because I didn't feel well. Whereas when I started to become aware of that stuff, I was like, well, I'm not feeling so good. And my tendency to act is maybe whatever it is, how people act when they're sick. But no, that can't be how I act. That's not how a professional acts. That's not how a leader acts. So I've got to summon a little bit of extra stuff. What's my mission today? My mission today is to overcome how I'm feeling and, do my job.
Right.
Whatever it is. So that's kind of it, right? If that is an acceptable answer to the question, but that's the best answer I have. And I think it matters for everything.
I want to ask you a question. I'm going to lob this out there. And I'm going to lob it out there first for you to think on for a moment. And then I'm going to share with the audience strategically where we're going to go with this show and why, right? So here's the question I'm going to lob at you. Doing this work with men for as many years as I've have, and obviously the years you've spent in training, and obviously in the SEAL teams and the FBI and all the leadership training, and also being a man, husband, and father, right? Because that's really important. There are two steps that I heard you share in that process that most men will completely, and when you talk about awareness, they will completely and totally say, yeah, it's there, but not going to do that. And yes, that too, not going to do that. Move on to the next one. And as you laid out that process, what really emerged for me was, wow, there are two things that men just try to jump right over and then go to the next thing. And then we scratch our heads like, why is this not working? I'm not really sure. So I want to share that with you. It's like, what are the two things that you think that most men miss out of that process and why? And then for the audience, Errol's coming on the show today because if you listen to the first one, we talked about the process of leadership. This time he's going to be really sharing a very cool story, right? And a very personal story. And that's how human beings learn, is through story, right? One of the coolest things that we say on this podcast a lot is, by sharing story, we can shorten the learning curve of the other people listening to it because they get the gems from it. So going back to the question, what do you think within that process is the two things that men miss most?
Well, I think it's obvious, and everybody listening is going to know what they are, but we'll just say it out loud, right? We skip the how am I feeling and how do I intuitively act on that feeling, because those are ugly realizations.
Yeah.
When I'm indifferent, that's not a good one. When I'm tired, I get super selfish, and therefore I walk into the kitchen and expect everybody to just know that I'm tired and tiptoe around me until I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
And then what we do, because we miss that, we may even have the planning thing well intact. But if we're not acting in good faith, if our behavior and the reason for our behavior isn't sound, we're making a good plan to do a bad thing. So what's my plan to get everybody off my ass? Right? Okay, right. I'm going to, whatever I'm going to do, I'm going to stomp around and make everybody run to the corners. Yeah, you made a good plan and it worked, but you made a good plan to do a bad thing. Right. So, you've got to have that first part in check.
Yeah.
And it's a good segue into the story, if that's okay, because I developed this process of mine essentially from self-preservation, because for some reason, well, I know now why, but at the time, for some reason, I thought to myself, why do I struggle so much with emotions? Right? I just had a hard time keeping them in check. And that included, it's easy to say, when I was angry or when I was insecure, right? Those real negative emotions. And I had a hard time reining those things in. I would just act on them. But also things like happiness, right? I wouldn't always respond appropriately to happiness. So, well, what does that mean? Errol, is there really an appropriate way to respond to happiness? Yeah, you can overdo it sometimes, right? You can be out there too much. You can be too happy and be messing around and laugh at it in inappropriate times. Right? There's a way to not handle your own happiness appropriately, in my view. But the point is, it was emotions that seemed to be outside of my control. And like we talked about in the beginning, every time I looked back on my life and said, where did I go sideways? It was when I allowed the emotion to drive what was happening, as opposed to me deciding how I was going to act on it.
Right.
So are you ready for? I'll set the stage for the story. Now, do me a favor. I have it right now because this is only a year in the making for me. So, and in our business, we're supposed to be able to tell a very detailed story very quickly and very succinctly. Okay. I'm not there yet. So jump in, interrupt. Okay. Break it up if you need to. Because I'll just kind of give the whole story.
Got it.
Okay. So back in the late 90s, I suffered 2 major head injuries as a Navy SEAL. One was we were doing what's called military operations in an urban terrain, mountain training. And that's what you kind of saw in Iraq, right? Soldiers going from house to house to house in urban terrain, going in, getting the bad guy, saving the good guy, right? That's what that's called. So we were doing this training and we were out in California. It was at nighttime and I was going to be the second guy in through the door. And all you do when you do that stuff is you go out, you read off the person in front of you. So if he went left, I was going to go right. He goes right, I go left. Pretty standard stuff. He went right, I went straight ahead or left, as the case was, and there was no floor in the building right there. The guy in front of me, saw that at the last second when he turned on his light, because this is before we had infrared and stuff like that, and he jumped quickly, instinctively to the right, and I was just right behind him, and I went down. So whack, I went about 10 to 12 feet onto concrete on my head. That had all sorts of repercussions. And again, this is not it is a bad thing, but nobody was doing it on purpose. Nobody was talking about head injuries back then. My head was cut open. They could see my skull. It was literally, we've got an hour left in training. Let's just finish it up and then we'll get to the hospital, and get this stitched up. And that's what we did. Right? Completely inappropriate, but that's just where we were. Next head injury was not, a short time later on actual deployment. We got tasked with a ship takedown, classic SEAL operation, right? There's a cargo ship out there and it's going to a place it shouldn't be going to. It's got people on it who shouldn't be on it with stuff on it that they're not allowed to have. So they call us, right? They say, take down that ship. And what we do is we just sneak up on our fast boats, right? We throw a ladder up about 30 feet on the side without the bad guys knowing. We climb up, take control of the ship, call in for reinforcements, and we go home. So super heavy sea state that day. I climb the 30 feet, and I know it's 30 feet because the caving ladder extends 30 feet, and it was fully extended. And I'm about to pull myself over, and I hear at the bottom, whack! And I knew what happened. The guy who was holding the ladder got thrown because the sea state was so heavy, and the ladder hooked onto a cleat at the top of the wave. So that when it came down, it was hard pointed at two places, and the ladder disintegrated, and I went 30 feet back into the boat. Again, that could be a whole nother hour conversation on what goes through your head when you're sure that you're falling to your death. That said, those are my injuries, or those are the two head injuries. I got medically, yeah.
Well, what was one or two things that was going through your mind?
Well, it's really weird because it happens. It's real. So the first thing was, I can't believe this is happening. Right? You're like, I can't believe this is happening. And true enough, I went to my life. And somehow I was able to do in less than a second kind of a synopsis. And I remember thinking to myself, good life. You did a good job. You weren't perfect. If I could do it again, I'd fix a couple things. But I really remember thinking this. You were honest. You work hard. You tried to be a good person. You can go down feeling good about that. The very first thing I thought was, because just as I was about to pull myself up and the ladder broke, the guys instinctively went and reached for me, right? And they missed me, obviously. And I remember thinking to myself, go out like a man, go out like a leader. Don't flail and scream. Let the men be proud of you and be like, wow, Doebler fell to his death and didn't say a word, And I don't know if that's the right thing or the wrong thing, but that's where my head was so focused on leadership, even at the time, right? I wanted people, I was like, well, I'm definitely dying. I want people to be like, wow, that guy, he went out like a man. He went out like a leader. And then we went quickly to good life. And then it went to what was going to happen to me as I hit, or whatever was going to happen. What I was sure was going to happen was I was going to fall in between the two boats, right? And because it just made perfect sense to me. And if that happened, what was going to happen is I was going to get sucked underneath the cargo ship into the screws and get chopped up. And, I just remember thinking, boy, I hope that goes fast because that's going to be terrible. So I was, it's just literally, I was like, I hope that goes fast because there's no way around it. The second thing I thought was going to happen was I'm going to land in the boat and the boat is just full of consoles and radars and weapons. I'm like, well, I'm going to fall on one of those things and impale myself. And that's going to be awful. So I hope that ends fast. And so it was just kind of a what's going to happen to me as well. So those are about the three things that went through my head. Turns out I landed on the one area that didn't have a weapon, didn't have a console, didn't have an antenna sticking up. It was the, probably the, I don't know, 5x5 space where the engine cover was, right? So I landed on that and my arm was out to the side. So that snapped and that destroyed all the nerves in my arm, right? And then I was like, so then I bounced back up. I was like, wow, I'm alive. I can't even believe this. Then I went to training mode. It's really weird the way it happens, right? But it happens. And I said, okay, now one of two things are going to happen. I'm going to fall back into the boat, or I'm going to go on the other side of the boat. Okay. And I'm going to have to survive. And so I remember thinking to myself, don't try to survive swimming because your arm isn't working. And, so you have a CO2 life vest on. I'm like, die trying to find your cartridge to inflate your boat. I ended up landing back in the boat, but that was essentially the injury that I got medically discharged for, because I lost use of kind of both my arms for a while and they weren't sure if they were going to come back. So that's a little bit about what happens when you're falling to your death.
Wow, man. I just want to pause here for a second and share one thing that you mentioned here. Number one, so first of all, as you're sharing those things going through your mind, I'm vicariously living. What would I be thinking about? What would I be saying? And what would I be doing? And going through each one of those three things that you went through in a millisecond, it was very revealing to me. And I invite the audience to ask themselves as well, what were you thinking during that? The first thing I was thinking of when you talked about good life, I was honest, I was this. There was that, but then there was also the things that emerged for me was unfinished business that I've been putting off.
Yeah.
That I wish I wouldn't have. And until you took me through that, I was like, I better get on that. Right. I better do those things. And then the decision of, wow, this could happen or this can happen. I hope it goes fast. I mean, obviously there's a lot of emotion that goes with that. But the other thing too is that I want to go to this statement that men are notorious for saying or thinking, rise to the occasion, rise to the occasion. Well, I've heard this from other special operators on the podcast, and I think you just emulated this lesson beautifully, is you don't rise to any occasion. You fall back on your training, which you did.
Yeah.
Right.
In every way. So I don't know that I'd be as proud to tell that story if the things that went through my head were different. Right. What I was proud of was what I thought of, because you never know. So why did I think those things? Well, because those are the things that I tried to live. Leadership was everything to me, especially as a SEAL officer. And whether I was good at it or bad at it, I cared about it and I worked at it. Nobody would ever say Errol Doebler didn't care about leadership, right? They would say, but I just never understood some of the mistakes that he made, right? Because they've said that to me. Like, I don't understand how you do so well here, and then you can't conduct yourself out in town. But that was the first thing, and that's again, and then good life, right? That type of thing. You don't get to think that. That is just what you think in those moments. So how do you think that? You have to live that life. You have to believe that that's the most important thing, and you live it, whether you succeed at it or not, because we won't. But as long as that is your focus, then in that moment where you've got, at least in your mind, 2 or 3 seconds left to live, that's how you get it. And rise to the occasion. You don't rise to the occasion unless you prepare for the occasion.
Yeah.
And again, for the sake of your podcast, which I love, and your audience, being a dad, it's the same thing. It's the exact same thing. There's going to be a moment of truth when your kid has to judge you. Okay, let's take it another step. What are they going to say? Right? And you can extrapolate out and go, well, here's what I hope they say. but here's what they'll probably say.
Right.
Okay. Well, there's time to change that. There's always time. Well, there's time to start changing that. But like we just said, the moment can come at any time. You never know when it is. So maybe I went on a little too much about that, but I think it's a great point.
No, I think that you didn't go on too long about it. That's men need to hear that. We need to hear that. We need to be reminded of that. And I love the fact your dog's in the background.
Oh, yeah.
My 150-pound dog is right here over my left shoulder. Just
my 110-pound dog is a little munchkin next to yours then.
I don't know. Mine's we joke about it that he's a 150-pound dog, but he's got the personality of an 8-pound cat. So
a lap dog or a lap cat, right? Yeah.
He's not. The reason we call him a cat is because he's like so independent, and he just like kind of does his own thing. And like you tell him to come over and see you, and he's just like, yeah, if I want to, if you let me, I'm over here just chilling out, busy. You know, your dogs are probably a little bit more obedient. So, okay, well, I appreciate the stories, and so does the audience, because we definitely got some gems out of that. But
good.
Yeah,
and
please continue.
Good applicable points too, and and I'm glad. I want you to keep jumping in because, like I said, the story is a monologue right now. I've not fully perfected it, but so they were going to allow me to stay in the SEAL teams, but my operating days for the foreseeable future were over, and I was going through, so it was a tough time in my life for a lot of different reasons. And these head injuries were causing me to make decisions that weren't great. I was making a lot of questionable decisions, even past the fact of what I told you, before, like, in these very stressful situations, I was very mindful and then I wasn't, but they just started to happen more and more. And, it was on, and you introduced me to Mark Devine. I was on his podcast. We were kind of going through this story, and I was just kind of half kidding, but half not kidding, saying this, after those head injuries, I just was making these bad decisions. And so when it was time to get out, or when it was time to make a decision, will I stay in and add value in an administrative capacity, which would have been a noble effort, I decided, no, I had to get out because I felt like my reputation was starting to get tarnished. And in the SEAL teams, reputation is everything. And I just said, I was making some of these decisions and I wasn't acting myself. And I said, I'm going to get out. I'm going to cut my losses. I feel ashamed at how I'm behaving. And maybe it's just time to go regroup. And Mark said the funniest thing. He goes, well, Errol, let me interrupt you. He goes, perhaps the two head injuries had something to do with your behavior. Maybe you're just being a little bit too hard on yourself. Nobody had ever said that to me before. And I kind of made a joke and dismissed it. But after the podcast was over, I went to my wife. I said, Mark said the funniest thing. And I relayed the conversation to her. And she goes, in a both incredibly sarcastic and loving way at the same time, yeah, you think falling on your head twice where you should have been killed had something to do perhaps with your behavior. So fast forward, we move out here to Colorado. I'm literally at a dinner party. It's like 1975. Like, hey, come over for a cocktail party.
So just for clarification, this is fascinating to me because I didn't know this, but the reason you and I are talking today about the journey that you're talking about is because of it started perhaps with the idea with Mark.
Yeah, because
okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, because he's the first one who put into my head there could be, like, it's not your fault. This might not be your fault, but what do you do with that, right? So here's where, because I remember I wasn't going to call Mark after you introduced me because I had been so detached from the SEAL teams for so long, and I was just like, what's done is done. And I've moved on. And, it was my wife who talked me into it. She goes, I think you have something in your head that the SEAL teams feel a certain way about you. I think you should just call the guy. I mean, Larry introduced you. It's going to be a mutual friend. And of course, as we know, Mark was fantastic. Guy got back to me in like 30 seconds. It was like, you come on anytime you want. And that made me feel good. And then subsequently, I had some more interaction with the teams, and one guy who had heard of me and heard about the injuries. He and for some reason I was on the phone with him, and he's like, Errol Doebler, Errol Doebler. He goes, the Doebler hole. He goes, you're the guy who fell through the hole at mount training. He goes, we named that after you. He goes, where have you been? And I remember thinking, like, oh, you don't think I'm an awful person, right? He was like, literally, shame on you. But then he goes, welcome back. And that, so anyway, that I digress. But you want to talk about brotherhood and things like that. Sometimes we have these things in our head and we create them. And that's what I did. And now I'm happy to say I'm finally integrating my way back into the SEAL community and being embraced with open arms. Why wouldn't I be? Anyway, so I'm at this cocktail party. And again, with what Mark had said in the back of my mind, as I'm listening to a doctor who's at the thing who specializes in traumatic brain injury, talking about this non-pharmaceutical treatment that he's been using, and it helps heal the brain, not mask the symptoms. And he's just going on about his passion. And just to get into the conversation, I'm literally like, oh, well, you know, I hit my head and I went through the two stories. And so now let me just take a quick step back. When I went to the medical review board, they were a little confused when I walk in because I look very much like I do now, right? I couldn't use my arms, but I looked normal. They weren't gone. And they said, you know, Errol, we're not sure what to do with you. Usually people come in here and it's very obvious what they need, right? They're missing a hand or whatever it is. And they're like, you seem okay. And I remember I said, I go, look, first of all, you guys called me in here. I didn't ask to come in here. Okay. And I said, so that's the first thing. And I said, I don't know if I'm going to get use of my arms again or not. I'm not worried about it. And the reason I'm not worried about it is because these headaches won't stop. I said, I'm worried about my head. I can't, the headaches are just devastating. And they come and go randomly, and I'm really worried about it. Now, traumatic brain injury wasn't on anybody's radar back then. They dismissed essentially what I had said. And I walked out of there going, I will never talk about these injuries again. I'll never be made to feel that way again. And for the better part of 20 to 25 years, I didn't. So now I'm at this party. Here's a doctor who's trying to help people. And he asked me after I told the story, he says, Errol, what happened? I said, well, doc, I just told you what happened. The two falls, the whole thing. He goes, no, what happened afterwards? So now I'm at a decision point. I haven't talked about it in all those years. And I said, well, Jesus, if I can't talk about it now, who am I? Here's a guy who's trying to help people. And so I said, well, doc, I said, you know, I said, I really struggle with emotions. I said, I get angry when I shouldn't. I don't get angry when I should. I even struggle with happiness and love and just how to handle these emotions. I said, I haven't had a good night's sleep, full night's sleep in probably 20 years. So, you know, there's that. And, you know, I said, so it's been a struggle, but, you know, I make do, and I'm just happy that you're going to help people.
When you say good night's sleep, can you give us some detail?
Yeah. You know, I can't recall, unless it's been nights that I've had too much to drink, which is also a byproduct of what might happen in some of these things, sleeping through the night. There's usually about 2 hours of the course of a night, and it's usually right around midnight-ish where I get up and I walk around, or I'll toss and turn. I just can't get through a full night sleeping. It's not nightmares or anything like that. It's just.
So you'll fall asleep, wake up for about 2 hours, go back to sleep.
Yeah. And then that causes disruptions in the day, right? Yeah. You know, now you're tired, and, you know, the whole thing. It's just it's a cycle. So
I don't even know about the psychological impact or the, you know, the science behind it. I just know that most people feel better that if they have 4.5, 5 hours of straight sleep versus 8 hours of broken.
Yeah.
Especially with right in that time window of like, I've been asleep for 2 or 3 hours, then I'm up for 2 hours, and then I sleep for another 4 to 6. And then it's just, you feel completely just wrecked.
Yep.
You know, a lot of people were just like, I would rather have 5 straight hours than 8 hours of broken sleep.
You know, that's a great point.
Yeah.
I never even thought about it that way, because I would always try to be in bed for 8 hours, right? Because I know 8 hours, right? But, you know, if I got 5 hours, I'd be like, ooh, but yeah, I don't know what the answer to that is. So, but, um, so he says to me, the doc, why don't you come in for a brain scan? There's this thing called a Wabi scan, which measures the energy in your brain. It's not an MRI or CT scan, which we now know can't detect brain injury. So all those people who got into a car accident and are having these head things go on, and they get a CT scan or an MRI, and they're like, "Oh, you're fine." And they're like, "But I don't feel fine." Well, that's why they're getting the wrong diagnosis. So go in, shoots out the result of the Wabi scan, and he goes, "Okay, some interesting things." And he points out this blue area in my brain. He's like, "The blue." He goes, "You know, you see this," and it was like mostly blue. And he goes, "The blue indicates that that part of your brain is dormant. It's not functioning, right?" And he goes, "That's classic traumatic brain injury, and that you have a severe case." And he goes, "What's more," he goes, "that's the part of your brain that regulates your emotions, your emotional response." I could have left there. I now had an explanation. I was injured and I didn't know it. And I said, "Okay, thanks, doc." He goes, "Well, that's not it." He goes, "There's two other things here." He goes, "You see these two sine waves in perfect sync?" He goes, "That's indicative of people who are very mindful and meditative and have very strong practices." So I shared my meditative practices, the Wim Hof method, among other things. And, and then he says, "Okay, this red part in your brain," he goes, "that indicates that your brain's in the perfect alpha state." He said, you're relaxed, you're poised, but you're ready for action. He goes, "It's the perfect state for the brain to be in." I'm like, "Hey, all right, I'm fantastic." He goes, "You're not getting it." He goes, "Your inability to process emotions in your traumatic brain injury." Okay, correction. He goes, "Your brain to be in the perfect alpha state and your heart and brainwave to be in perfect sync is completely contrary to your inability to properly process emotions and your traumatic brain injury. There shouldn't be the two things." He goes, at best, you should be at a very dark place in your life." He goes, "At worst, you should really be one of those 22 veterans a day who's committed suicide. That's how serious your injuries are." So he goes, "Walk me through this leadership process of yours and this Wim Hof method. Walk me through it." So again, my process is what we talked about in the beginning, right? Recognizing the emotion, the intuitive action on the emotion, establishing a new behavior based on what you need, making a plan, reflecting. I walked him through that. And he goes, "Well, when do you do that?" I go, "I do that every time I walk into a room." He goes, "Every time you walk into a room?" I go, "Every time I walk into a room, every time the situation in a room changes, I go through that process." I said, "Because if I don't, I'm going to make a bad decision, right? I'm going to act emotionally without thinking." He goes, "That sounds exhausting." I go, "It's exhausting." I go, it is the most exhausting thing I do. But if I don't do it, the alternative, which I know, is unacceptable. So that's it. So he's like, "You have a hyper awareness of everything you do all the time." I said, "Yes." He goes, "All right, explain this Wim Hof method thing to me." So I explained the Wim Hof method and the breathing. And essentially, on the physiological and health side, it resets your nervous system, right? All scientifically proven, right? Wim Hof doesn't do anything without a team of scientists now. So his breathing and his cold exposure has been shown to release the body of the inflammation caused by stress, okay? And we know that inflammation is the key driver to pretty much every malady out there we have now: cancer, diabetes, all that stuff starts with chronic inflammation. So I said, I use this process, right? It releases the inflammation from stress so I can think clearly, right? So now I'm clearly thinking, even though I'm jumbled inside, it's clear jumble. And I can at least now go through my process and get through the day. And then the stress created by whatever I'm doing, it gets reset every day. He goes, "Well, that explains it." He goes, "Your process." And then I said, I use the cold exposure to practice these elements, right? How do you practice emotional awareness? Well, if your intention before you get into an ice bath is to identify your emotions, you're not going to have to look far, right? The emotions are going to be there. So I build habits with all these elements of the process by using the cold. So that's what I do. That's my life. And that's what he said. He goes, you've saved your own life. And he goes, again, at best, you should be in a dark place. He goes, but this process of yours has your just awareness around everything and then the resetting your nervous system. He goes, that's the only explanation. Fast forward, I don't even get the whole treatment. And essentially the treatment, this part of it is just intranasal insulin. Drip insulin into your nose with your head backwards. It drips into the brain, gives your brain energy. Healing, right? Trust me, I'm going through the whole thing now to get this thing, help get this thing patented and make it everybody's treatment. But I only did one small part of the treatment. Came back in maybe a month later, not even. And we do another Wabi scan and he goes, okay, I've never seen anything like this. He starts looking at areas of the brain. He goes, see where the first scan you had 2 megahertz of energy and now you've got 30 megahertz of energy. And he's going through all the parts of the brain. He goes, you see the blue? I go, I don't really see so much of the blue. He's like, right, because it's disappearing. Your brain is healing. So I said, well, he goes, I've never seen a recovery like this in my life. And I go, well, what do you attribute that to? He goes, I attribute it to the same thing that saved your life. I said, Errol, this process, this lifestyle that you put yourself through, your body, mind, and spirit was in such a state, such a prime state to be well, that when we gave your brain one small catalyst, it exploded with energy. You were just ready. And so then we talked about do you have to still go through this process? Every time you walk into a room. And I said, no, it's what's funny is it's starting to stick now. Right now, it's just what's happening. Right. So all the work that I always do about walk in, remain calm, remain in the moment, it's happening more automatically. It's like, right, because your brain's allowing it to happen, to absorb it. You're now allowing it to become a part of your self-conscious. What am I trying to say? Part of your whatever it is when you do things automatically based on habits. I'm drawing a blank.
It's just part of how it's like the Arrow operating system.
Yeah, and
it's
so
just how you operate now.
It's now your go-to behavior, and it just so happened before when you had this injury, you always had to be thinking about it. 2 final steps, because I know we're getting close, but this is going to bring it home, because what we talk about is, all right, this is my process and it saved my life. Wow, that's super extreme, Errol. That's a great story and good for you. Now I'm going to go off. And the answer is no. First of all, this is what everybody can do. And does it work? Okay. So 2 areas where it works and it's completely validated, and every father out there listening will know this to be true. Second, I got into the car after I did the treatment. My wife didn't even know I was doing the treatment with the insulin. She just thought I was going in there for the scan. Get in the car, and she goes, something's different. What happened in there? I said, well, what do you mean? We did the whole thing. It was great. And I go, oh, yeah. And he put some insulin in my nose and whatever. She goes, I know you work hard at being calm and all that stuff. And, she goes, something's different right now. The energy you're putting off is completely different. What does that mean? Right? That's how I always tried to be. And finally, I got that catalyst to get better. And then that became my go-to behavior. She says that to me 4 times a week now. Right? She's like, it just keeps getting better. Right? It's unbelievable. Right? So, she'll joke, I'm married to a different person, but I'm married to all the best parts of the first person that I married, and all those bad things have started to kind of dissipate. You are now the person you've always tried to be through this process. Second, and most importantly, when you have a traumatic brain injury, at least for me, I was very sensitive to noise. Makes sense, right? Somebody be eating a carrot, and I'm like, really, with the carrot? I remember just people chewing. It would just make me crazy. And I remember one time my wife was eating an apple or watching TV, and I'm like, come on, really? She's like, it's an apple. It makes noise. It was one of those things. That doesn't
it's healthy for you.
Come on. Right? Like, what are you doing? Shut up already.
Right.
So, but the dog barking, something falling, right? It would just set me off. So I'm in this, and the kids would always be kind of on eggshells around me. Everybody would be. This whole thing happens. I'm starting to become the person I've always worked to become by, doing these things. And now it's sticking. One day I'm watching TV, and my daughter, who is the universe's angel, she has not a bad bone in her body. Just wants love, and it's unbelievable. And she's 8. And she walks up behind me. I didn't know she was there. And now, if my son was doing this, he might have had a more nefarious purpose in mind, right? But it's my daughter, and she has nothing but love in mind. She screams in my ear, "Daddy, I love you." I didn't know she was there. So I turned around, I grabbed her. I said, "Oh, don't yell in Daddy's ear like that." And we had a good laugh about it, right? And about 5 minutes later, I started to get really scared, because I was like, if that happened 6 months ago, my intuitive reaction would have been this: whack, an elbow in the face, just because it would have been that quick, right? And now my behavior is normal behavior, right? And again, it's because of what I got healed, but that's not really the magic of the story. I got healed and then started to behave in the way that I wanted to. I could have been healed and gone back to some crappy behaviors, right? And still been healed. It almost wouldn't have mattered. What matters, and for the purpose of this story, is when we are aware of these things, these elements to the decision-making process, when we take care of our nervous system, reset it, learn how to get reset, we can become truly the people we want to become. And that's the moral of my story. That's why I say this process is validated. And we talked about beforehand, like, is it too extreme for people to grasp? And my response is, the traumatic brain injury part of it is to get your attention and to say, wow, this guy really should have committed suicide, but it was this process that saved him. And it sounds like a process that I could just use, even though I'm not injured, even though I don't have some awful thing going on in my life, but I certainly want to get better. Well, here it is. So I don't know if I put a bow on that or not. With our concern is this story going to resonate enough with the audience?
No, I think so. Really quickly here, I want to give you a situation, and I think it would be really, really meaningful for for you to walk us through it.
Yep.
So I'll give you the situation here in a second, but I want to say something first. It's fascinating that your wife has said what she said to you, which is like something's different.
Yep.
Have you read the book Power versus Force?
No.
It's fantastic.
All right, I
So
will read it.
it's probably one of the best books, and it's right up your alley with exactly what you're talking about today. So one of the things in that book is basically the vibrations that we give off with certain emotions. So, like, for instance, you, me, let's, in the audience too, think of someone that that you feel their emotions. It's like, think of your father, think of your mother, your wife, or whatever. You see a look on their face, or you just sort of sense it. You're like, ooh, today must have been bad, or something's not right. It's just, you don't know what it is. You just know it's there. That's a vibration, that power versus force. So, like, all these emotions that we have. And the cool thing from a kinesiology standpoint, they were actually able to measure the vibrational force energy of these emotions in a room, right?
It's absolutely real. It's absolutely real. Yep.
And and also consequently, the flip side is, think of when you see your kid and immediately whether they had a good day or a bad day at school. Yep. Immediately. They don't have to say a word, right? Yep. That's power versus force.
Right.
So here's the fascinating thing. Your wife mentioned that to you. I didn't mention this to you, but as soon as we clicked on this Zoom call, I was like, Errol looks different to me. And not aesthetically, but different. Right. There was something different about you than the first couple times that we talked. It was your body language, your posture, the look in your eye. the best scenario I could, have you ever seen the movie Cinderella Man with Russell Crowe?
Yeah. Yeah.
James Braddock.
Yep.
It reminded me a lot of when, James Braddock, he's at a high point and then the depression hits, he's at a low point, he can't win a fight to save his life. The boxing commission like basically kicks him out of boxing. He's living in the slums, very low point of his life, breaks his hand, and then he gets a fight with a guy, with like a week or a couple days notice or whatever, for a guy who's going to be going for the title. And then he walks in that ring and the crowd is cheering for him. And you just see this look on Russell Crowe's face. And he's just like, you knew he meant business. Right. Something had clicked, right? Yeah. Something was different. And that's about the best way I can describe your energy when you stepped in here. I was like, man, something just feels different.
And again, it's you're not the first person to say that to me.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm not.
It's humbling and it's for the better.
Yeah.
And but again, we can say, well, Errol got healed. Yeah, but what did I fall back on? Right? What was because all I ever wanted was to be able to walk into a room, have a good calming energy, right? And if I'm mad, not have it overwhelm the room, be able to say, hey, I'm a little mad at this, right? Just state it as a fact. And so that's the behavior when I got healed that I felt finally was able to fall back on, subconsciously or unconsciously, I suppose. So what's your scenario?
So here's the scenario, because men transitioning from work mode to family mode is the hardest thing. And here's the thing, we all want it. I personally think, and I don't have really a whole lot of proof to back this up, but I think it's like primal DNA wiring. It's a lot like when we go out for the hunt and then suddenly we have to come back to the cave and go from hunter mode to hunter gatherer, go out and kill it, business, that kind of thing, or whatever we're doing. Suddenly now we're like, now I need to be husband. Now I need to be father. So how do I make that transition? That's one of the hardest. And if the hunt wasn't good, you feel a bit defeated, a bit irritated, a bit irritable, that you're not in a good headspace. So I would love for you to walk us through. How would this process look for a man transitioning from work mode to family mode?
The hardest challenge that they've got. So the analogy,
this is a Navy SEAL saying the hardest transition, right?
It is, because it is.
Yeah.
So the scenario that I give people is this. I used to run triathlons, right? Doesn't matter if you've ever run a triathlon. Everybody pretty much knows what it is, right? You swim, then you move to a bike, then you move to a run. Okay. And I used to do them a lot. And I would have good swim, bike, and run times, but I still wouldn't finish well. And I remember thinking, okay, how do you shave 5 minutes off your time, for God's sakes? Because that's going to be the difference between 3rd and 15th. And I remember thinking, you know what? I'm not transitioning. I'm not saying I'm out of the water. Now, the moment between the swim and the bike is its new thing. This is a new race. I have to have a new mindset transitioning from that part. So now the run after the swim to the bike and getting the stuff on is a different part of the race. It's not a triathlon now, it's a 5-athlon, whatever. It's the same concept, right? So we're driving, we pull into our driveway, and we're walking in. There's a new transition. You have to be aware. The awareness is everything, right? You have to be aware of now. I am now moving from work mode to family mode. And it doesn't matter if you're working from home, right? Or you're traveling from an office. It does not matter because it's still the same. You're coming out of that back bedroom, okay? Day's over. Okay, where am I now? You go through the process. Where's my emotion? My emotion is pissed off because I had a terrible day. My emotion is, I don't know if tired or exhaustion is an emotion, but you know what I mean. Okay, I'm aware of it. What is my intuitive action based on that? It's going to be to go sit by myself. I want to drink. I want to read the paper. I want you to leave me alone. Okay. Is that the right behavior for the situation? Probably not. Okay. What is the right behavior? You tell me. I have to be, what does a great dad look like? What does a great husband look like? I have to make sure that I'm jovial. I make sure I'm engaging. Whatever you decide it is, it is. Okay. It might be, I have to be communicative. Hey, wife. Hey, son and daughter, I am having a really hard time. Can I get 10 minutes? by myself. Is everybody okay with that? Now, the wife might go, no, because I've been dealing with this all day. Suck it up. Cool. You've got a new situation on your hand. You've got a new, right? I'm in dad mode, right? All you're doing is transitioning. So the transition has to be first and foremost in your mind. Then you just go through the process, right? The plan. What is the plan? Let's say I get home. I use an old Navy SEAL planning process. SMAC is the acronym. What's the situation? Set of circumstances dictating a need for action. I'm about to walk into the house and I can't let the day's work go. I'm holding on to it. What is my mission? My mission is, I don't know, you decide, to ask for some grace when I walk in, to shed the day's work and act like a father or husband, whatever that means to you in the most positive way. What will the actions be, right? I will tell them I had a tough day, but can I get a hug, right? I'm going to give everybody a hug. And maybe I'm going to tell them I had a tough day. Can you listen? Or I'm going to assess the situation and it's chaos. I'm going to go help with the dishes, right? Whatever it is, whatever your actions are, you've got to identify them based on the mission, based on the situation to transition. So that's kind of a long answer. The bottom line is it's still the awareness of where your emotions are, and it's understanding you're transitioning to a different phase of the day, a different character. You are no longer work Larry. You are now husband Larry. You are now dad Larry. And what does that look like? If you're not aware of that, you can't make the adjustment. Does that help? Did we give somebody something to walk away with?
It totally does. I just want to make sure I captured. I was writing the stuff down. SMAC, is it SMACK?
SMACCC. So
CCC. Okay.
you identify the situation, the set of circumstances dictating a need for action. Based on that, what is your mission? You could have several missions, but you've got to identify it. You've got to call them out. Then what are the actions you need to take to accomplish that mission? First C, contingencies.
Okay.
What will I do if, right? I am transitioning now from work dad to dad, and I'm going to do all these great things. What will I do? What will I do if my wife isn't quite in the place to receive all that? And all of a sudden, I become the punching bag. Whatever your answer is, but be thinking about it. That's something that can go wrong. Let me make sure I react to that properly. So now I'm ready for it, right? Series of contingencies. In a larger context, the other C is command. Who's in charge of what? In this situation, you're in charge of everything. You're in charge of the mission, you're in charge of the actions, but somebody's name needs to be in command of each action in each mission. And then the final thing is communication. Mm-hmm. Again, inside the acronym, it's not the soft skills of communication. It's typically when will we talk, about what will we talk, for how long will we talk, who will we talk with? Okay, it's more of a business and military aspect, but you still account for it, right? So in my thing is, if you account for all these elements of SMAC, you'll succeed. They may not be applicable, right? Command, all right, not necessarily applicable. I'm in charge. Communication, well, I'm going in right now to talk to everybody. I don't have a whole lot of control over that. So I accounted for it, not totally applicable. The other stuff, always applicable. So when you walk in, you make the transition. How do I execute it? I have to have a good plan. Those are the elements of the plan. Account for those elements, you will succeed.
See, this is what's so cool, Errol. And by the way, I'm the reason I asked about SMAC was because I had picked up on the situation, mission, and action. I was like, well, what's CK? Right. But I'm glad we got the 3 C's in there and how we can leverage those. The cool thing too is that I wrote down, where are my emotions at?
Yep.
And based on those emotions, what action?
Yep.
I really, really like that a lot. And the transitions. The cool thing is, God bless Errol. Where were you like 10 years ago in my life, right?
Well, you figured it out on your own. And I guarantee that you went through this process. You weren't intuitively aware of each one of the elements. Mm-hmm. You are now, because you did it. If you reflected back. And I think that's the power of letting the men know this. Wherever you are now, this is the decision-making process that you go through, whether you know it or not. You are either ignoring these elements, right? Or you're just not aware of them or conscious of them, so you can't make adjustments to them.
Right. Here's the thing, Errol, and this is what I love about this podcast and show. I've done 1,000 of these interviews now, and I will never ever say that I know it all. In fact, I always say this is the front row seat of the classroom, which is super cool because I get to ask all the questions. Hey, teach. Hey, teach.
Right.
Hey, teach. Right. Uh, I never knew this process though until right now, which I
Yeah.
love it because this old cliche of like men never stop and ask for directions. Personally, I think it's complete and total BS. I don't know about you, but maybe call me efficient or whatever. I don't like wasting time. If I go into Lowe's and I'm looking for a 1/8 screw, nut and
Right.
bolt or whatever, I'm gonna go first person I see. I'm gonna go ask, what aisle do I
Where,
find that in?
what aisle?
I'm
Not
not
only what aisle, can you show me where they are?
right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can you actually walk me there? Because when I get there, I will not be able to find them. So,
Right.
yeah, sometimes I'll even do that, especially like little things like that. I hate wasting time.
Yeah.
I'm this true believer that if you give men GPS, they will feel a heck of a lot better. They'll be more confident. And we know the map, right? We know that training, don't rise to the occasion, fall back on your training. It's like, okay, where am I in the process right now?
Yep.
Where
Where
am
am I
I
in
in
the
the map?
process?
Yeah. And if you know that, then we teach this other thing too. Like we teach communication excellence, and for sake of time, I won't go into that. But it's a 4-step process, and through that, it's a way to avoid triggering conversations. It's a way to have a solid conversation rather than a triggering one, and that's a 4-step process. And in order to do that, you have to know where you're at in the
You
process.
have to know where you are. And this is what I
Yeah.
say the beauty of my process is what you just said, your 4-step process, which I have no doubt is amazing. Everything fits inside of my process. Where does that fit? That fits inside of actions, right? Missions and actions, the plan. What's the situation? Whatever it is, what's my mission? To communicate effectively. What will I do? I'll go to Larry's 4-step process. Those are my actions.
Yeah.
But you can't get there, like you said, unless you are have those first 2 elements. How am I feeling? What is my intuitive action based on that emotion? Am I aware of it? Is that the right one? If not, what's the right one? And boom, now you go to your thing. It fits right there perfectly, right?
Love it, man. You've got a couple things coming up. I want to make sure the audience, knows what they are, and
Yep.
you've got a retreat and some other resources as well. And where can men find all that?
Well, so leader193.com is my website. It's pretty good website, so you'll be able to figure out everything we do from there. So go visit that. But there's always the book, right? Everything we just talked about is outlined in the Process, Art, and Science of Leadership. It's an audio and video. Everything. So when I'm with a client, this is the process we go through. We break down each one of these elements week by week. And what I have for them is a series of videos, short videos on that element, right? So emotional awareness and recognition, I've got, 5 or 6 3 to 5 minute videos that talk about it. And then here's what I'd like you to try for the week based on this. And then we have our one-on-one or group calls. We've made that video series available to everybody. And so if you like what you heard here, even about the Wim Hof method and that's all in there. It's our online academy. What we'll do is in your show notes, we'll give you a coupon code for your listeners. They can go, get, we'll probably give 20% off or something like that. And they'll love it. And then we've got an in-person open retreat, which again, hits all of these things we talked about. We'll do cold exposure, we'll do breathing. We'll talk about this leadership process over the course of 3 days, November 11th through 13th, outside of Aspen, Colorado. And it's going to be super powerful. It's at a retreat in the woods, in the mountains. And what we'll do is if people get on my website and they contact me and say, hey, I want to come to this retreat. I heard you on, the Dad Edge. We'll cut you a break on that. We'll talk about it. And so that's November 11th through 13th. So those are the big things we've got going.
Man, this has been super cool, Errol. And thank you listen, anytime, men are generous with our audience, they really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. We need to give more men resources here. Gentlemen, you won't have to look far for that. Head on over to thedadedge.com/Friday 74 for this show. Again, thedadedge.com/Friday 74 to get more information about that. We'll have all the links in the show notes for you. Errol, this has been awesome, man. It's so good to see you again. And dude, and you bringing this new energy is super cool, man. I can feel it, man.
I appreciate it. And I really appreciate you letting me come back on and share this, because I think your audience, I know it's tailor-made, and look, we just want to add value to each other. right? Because God knows we need it.
We do, man. We do. Gentlemen, this is how we change the game, right? And like I said, this is how we change the game. Don't be afraid of having a process in place. Don't be afraid to have a strategic map in place, right? These are the things we need. Again, go to thedadedge.com/Friday 74 for this show and go out, live legendary. Take care.